Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on sector performance reporting, joining the dots to detect risk and prevent harm. My name is Janet Anderson, I'm the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner and I'll be chairing today's webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, wherever you are in Australia, and paying my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for today's webinar. Before we get into today's topic, I want to make sure that all of you were aware that last week the Australian government introduced the Aged Care Bill, and it certainly received a lot of media coverage. And subject to parliamentary processes, there's an expectation that that bill will come into force as an act from the 1st of July next year, 2025. So I do want to refer you to our draft guidance resources that we've published on our website for the strengthened quality standards, and also tell you that we are finalising those resources on the basis of feedback that you and others have provided, and we expect to be able to produce the final version of those resources for the strengthened standards by the end of the year. We will also be establishing a dedicated section on our website which will provide you with access to key information, tools and resources to support you as a provider in preparing for the new Act. So please check it out. Final ad is for our Regulatory Strategy 24-25, which is also now available on our website. And I do hope you've already had a chance of looking through it. We've had some good feedback so far. That strategy details how we are changing our regulatory practice to ensure that we're ready to deliver on our intent under the new legislation. So we discussed the strategy in detail in our July sector webinar, and you can have a look at that recording on our website also. Now, back to today's proceeding. I am joined by four of my colleagues from the Commission: Lisa Peterson, a Deputy Commissioner, Anthony Speed, an Executive Director, Peter Edwards, another Executive Director, and Anita Francis, who works with our Chief Clinical Advisor as a Senior Clinical Advisor. Each of them is going to be focusing on a specific element of the Commission's sector performance report. And we'll be talking about how the information is valuable to us and to you to support continuous improvement. Just before we kick off proceedings with the panel members, I thought I'd provide a very brief overview and some context. Our sector performance report contains a range of data, which has actually changed over time, that we use to assess sector-wide performance and risks to the quality of care that older people receive. And it draws on our findings from audits, the complaints that we resolve, serious incident notifications, and mandatory reporting from providers, including on the quality indicators. And what we do is join the dots between all of this data to decide where we should be focusing our attention at a sector-wide level and in relation to individual providers. So in that way, we're converting data into intelligence that we use to inform our regulatory gaze. And obviously, we're very keen for providers to use it in a similar way as an opportunity to reflect on their own performance and to identify areas for improvement. And each of our four speakers will be talking about aspects of the data and the way in which we would seek for you to use it. So briefly on housekeeping, you can send your questions in at any time. Please use the question box via the live Q&A tab, which should be visible on your screen. We also have a short survey for you to complete at the end of today's webinar if you just stay on. We always value getting your feedback. We do pay close attention to it. It informs not only how we can get better at delivering these webinars, but also some of the content and the topics that we would select that you have indicated you have an interest in hearing about. Today's webinar is being recorded and it will be published on our website in coming days. And we're also sending a link to those of you who've registered so that you can get direct access to that recording. I'd now like to invite Lisa Peterson, who's Deputy Commissioner Sector Capability and Regulatory Strategy, to start off the discussion. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Janet. Hi, everybody. Thanks you very much for joining us for the conversation this afternoon. Well, over the past year, the Commission's been working hard to improve how we report each quarter on the provider performance through our sector performance report. And as Janet's explained, in the report, we present how we see the sector, and we draw on data that we gather through the Commission's wide range of regulatory activities, and also through the data that you report into the Department of Health and Aged Care and to the Commission. And the purpose of the report is to share how we understand the performance of the sector, and to give you, the provider, the information that you need to take proactive and preventative action where there might be gaps or untreated risks that could cause harm to older people, and of course to continue to build on what's working well. So the goal here is one that we share, and that's a consistently great experience for every older Australian receiving aged care. And the feedback we've had on the report so far is it's now more practical and useful for providers and other readers, and we'll continue to make improvements based on your feedback. So this afternoon, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to provide you with a sneak preview of the Q4 Sector Performance Report. And the report shows us the results for the final quarter of the 23-24 financial year. There's a lot of information in the report, and we hope that you can engage in it when the full report is published next week. Excitingly, we have also included a special year in review section, which provides commentary on sector performance in 23-24 compared to 22-23. And we do that across a range of metrics, including compliance with the quality standards, complaints, and serious incident reporting. We thought that this afternoon you would be interested to hear about our findings on compliance against the quality standards, and we measured this through the outcomes of our audit programs for both residential and home services. And what you can see in the graph is that there's been a significant and welcome uplift in compliance with the quality standards over the past 2 years, which really kicked in at the beginning of the 2023 financial year. And that's good news. But we can also observe that over the course of 23-24, there hasn't been a significant change in compliance rates against the quality standards in either residential care or home services. So we can see the compliance rates in residential care hovered around 80% for most of the year. And that means that 1 in 5 residential aged care providers are not yet compliant with at least one requirement of the quality standards. Now, we acknowledge that this is a big lift compared to the 58% compliance we saw at the beginning of 22-23. And pleasingly, we can see that that lift has been sustained, which is really important. But we do need to see a shift in that last 20% if all older Australians are to receive consistently the great care that they deserve. And we see a similar pattern in home services. There was a big lift in the beginning of 23-24 where compliance lifted from 46% up to 65%. And again, the gains have been stable over the year, but without further improvement. And the Commission and the community, we think, are right to be concerned about that, because it means that 1 in 3 Australians are not getting the services at the standards that they deserve. So our takeaways from our data analysis in relation to the quality standards shows us that there are 3 key areas for providers to focus on to lift the overall quality of care being delivered across the sector. So firstly, home services, in particular how provider systems and processes are playing out at the service level, clinical and personal care, and organisational governance. So this afternoon we'll be talking you through our home services audit program and highlighting some of the issues of concern that we see consistently in our quality audits and in other sources of intelligence such as complaints. And we'll have a look at what providers can do to address care and clinical related harms, which are a major cause of non-compliance. And we'll talk about the outliers. So these are those hard to shift individuals or groups of providers that make up that 20% in residential care and 35% in home services. But there's a couple of other points I'd like to make before we move on to the next part of the presentation. So a key part of our regulatory role is to understand patterns of performance across the sector and amongst groups of providers, including where we see an absence of risk controls that might contribute to unmanaged risks and non-compliance. And we've made a start that you will have seen in the report this year in our sector segmentation section, where we show results by provider size and ownership type. And this is intended to help you to compare your results with similar types of providers, but it also helps us to hone in on features that might be influencing performance and causing stickiness in those groups of providers where we're not seeing improvement on specific issues. So you can expect to see more of that in our reports over the coming year. And our recently released regulatory strategy, as Janet mentioned, contains a lot of detail about how we tackle these issues and how we work towards our goal of achieving safe quality care for all older Australians. And there are two components in our reg strategy that are particularly relevant to this discussion. And firstly, we've got the regulatory diamond, and secondly, our provider supervision model. And the sector performance graphs that I've shown you really focus on the bottom half of the diamond. But you can see that getting us to 100% compliance only gets us to the middle. And neither we nor the sector should stop at minimum compliance, because older Australians deserve great care that's consistently excellent, not just compliance care. And we want to see all providers, including those of you who are consistently compliant, moving higher up the diamond. So you're going to hear some commentary today about the importance of good governance and engaged leadership as the foundation of great aged care. But before we get to that, I would like to remind everyone about the Governing for Reform in Aged Care program. So this is a program delivered by the Commission, and it supports governing body members and executives and leaders to strengthen corporate and clinical governance capabilities. And in fact, it's now available to anyone in aged care who wants to improve their governance capability. And since the program launched in March 2022, we've had thousands of leaders across the sector have participated in the program. And the sorts of things you can do include online learning modules, there's practical governance tools and templates, there's board kits, podcasts, and live learning events such as webinars and workshops. And it's a self-directed program that you can do at your own pace. Outcomes for participants include an improved knowledge of practical application of good aged care governance practice, as well as inspiration from peers and exemplars. And this program is free to all aged care sector colleagues and governing bodies, and you can find the program on the Commission website. Thanks, Janet. Back to you.
Okay, there's an enormous amount that Lisa's just covered, and some of you have already put your questions in, so keep them coming, and thank you very much. Well done, Lisa. I'm now going to invite Anthony Speed, Executive Director, Quality Assessment and Monitoring, to talk to us about the approach the Commission takes to assessing home services compliance. Anthony.
Thanks, Janet. And as you saw in Lisa's presentation, home services overall don't do as well as residential services when it comes to compliance with the quality standards. We've seen that welcome uplift over the last 2 years, but the performance has not improved significantly over the past financial year. And so that's one of the reasons why the Commission has made significant enhancements to the way that we approach our quality audits of home services that I want to talk about today. But before then, the standard that we consistently see lower levels of compliance is in relation to quality standard organisational governance. So as part of the quality review process, we are now taking a closer look at the provider's organisational arrangements, including how the provider governs itself. So we know that good care depends on good governance, and we know that this provides for all of the underlying systems and processes that providers need to have in place to monitor how they perform and to identify any areas for improvement, and then importantly to take the steps to address these in a timely way. We need home service providers to be investing in their governance systems. We need to know that they're ensuring that they're functioning well. And our quality audits are looking at provider management systems, and they're looking at the processes and how providers are putting into action these processes across their services. Providers must be able to demonstrate the effective risk management systems that they have in place, including the appropriate governance that supports the delivery of safe and quality care. And we want to understand that if the risks and issues that we identify are about how the provider runs their business, and we want to also understand about how they're applying that at an individual service level. And when we explore these risks, we typically see that the provider level, that there are relationships between those service level issues and the absence of effective controls. Now, considering that the large number of older Australians receiving care through home care packages and the Commonwealth Home Support Program represented on this slide, it's crucial that providers get this right. You can see from this chart here that there are over 744,000 people getting home care packages and over 800,000 people using CHSP services. These are astounding figures. We ask in our audit processes specific questions about how the organisation is run and how this translates to safe and quality care at a service level. So some of the questions that we ask are seeking to understand how advisory bodies effectively used within the organisation to promote quality care, or how assessment and planning is occurring at an organisational level. Another one we ask is, we're looking for is how regularly does the governing body receive reporting about risks and incidents in their services? And what are they doing with that information? And we also want to know how you ensure that care outcomes for older people receiving services through subcontracted organisations, including for older people who are receiving fully managed or self-managed packages, how are these being monitored? And answers to these questions are important for us to understand because of how home services are delivered. It's not always possible to have the direct observation of home care that we have in the residential services sector. So this means that the quality systems and controls that providers have must be sufficiently robust to have a really good level of understanding about whether the care is safe, whether it's high quality, and importantly, whether it's meeting the needs of individuals. Another significant change we've made is that we now include a broader sample of provider home services in a single quality audit. And we made this change because when we looked at the data of all the home service providers audited, we found that 90% of them already had a single quality audit. And making this change brings a consistent approach to how we audit all home services providers. So previously, for a large number of home service providers, we may have conducted a number of different smaller quality audits covering different groups of their services, and we may have done this at different times. But now, under our current approach, the provider will be audited once, and the audit will cover all of their services. And this has led to an increase in quality audits in Q3 and Q4, as shown on this graph here. And it also positions us to apply provider level supervision into the future. The new regulatory framework that will come into play under the New Aged Care Act is intending to have a single provider level audit of all Category 4 and Category 5 services delivered by a provider. So by adopting the changes I've outlined in our current audit program for home services, we can move sooner to a provider level audit process for all providers. And we've had very positive feedback from providers about how this new approach is working. And this puts us in a good position to apply what we've learned from our current approach into the anticipated arrangements under the New Aged Care Act. And this approach is part of our overall shift to focus more on the provider rather than the service, which is part of the regulatory strategy Janet mentioned at the outset. I've already spoken about the need for improved governance. Another area where the data indicates that improvement is required is in relation to Quality Standard 2, assessment and planning. As the graph shows, compliance with this standard has improved over the past 2 years, but it is still significantly lower than in residential care. And along with governance, it is the standard in home services that consistently has the lowest compliance rate. Now, assessment and planning involving the older person is integral to the delivery of care that is safe and that meets the quality expectations. We need home service providers to be responsive to older persons' changing needs and to be working with them closely to ensure that their care and services align with their changing needs. And of course, the quality standards are only one of the ways we measure harm and risk to older Australians receiving care. The Serious Incident Response Scheme is another significant source of intelligence about potential harm and harm. And you can see on this slide that we are getting a lot less intelligence from serious incident reporting about home services than we do about residential care. Now, one reason for this would be the episodic nature of home services, where a care worker spends a finite amount of time with the older person who is not in a 24/7 care environment. However, we know this is unlikely to be the full reason. SIRS in home service has now been operating since December 22, and so the low reporting rates can no longer be attributed to a lack of awareness of the scheme. And we've done several mail-outs to home services providers to remind them of this obligation to report. Another explanation here is that services are offered at a lower risk than in residential care. Now, while that may be true for individual services, sending carers into people's homes unsupervised is by no means a uniformly zero or low risk arrangement. Another explanation, which we will be exploring further, is the link between low reporting, or no reporting in some cases, and governance. So if you don't have the governance in place to know what is going on at the point of care, it's highly unlikely that you'll be reporting incidents as they occur. This is reflected in lower reporting and unacceptably high risk of harm to people receiving services. And complaints, of course, are another major source of intelligence for us. The complaints that we receive about home services have remained remarkably consistent. They relate to communication, to management of packages, to fees and charges, consistency of client care and coordination. And these are all the most common complaints that we know about home services. These complaints tend to cluster in quality standard 2, in ongoing assessment and planning, but also signal that all may not be well in quality standard 8, organisational governance. And this reinforces the need for provider and organisational level approach to the regulation of aged care. Finally, I want to share with you a case study which appears in the Q4 sector performance report in focus on provider supervision, where the inherent risks of poor governance in home services and delivering care in rural and remote areas became an area of concern for us. The provider in question was the only provider of home services covering a very large remote area, including many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And a quality audit that we undertook showed that there were issues with their governance of subcontracted clinical care in the home care packages that were being delivered. And the key issue we identified was that they did not have the structure, the capability, or the capacity to meet the needs of people receiving care with complex needs. And this meant that there was a critical shortage of aged care services for elders with high care needs in that region. So we spoke with elders and their representatives and worked with the provider to understand the issues in the care that they were delivering. And this provider is now under heightened supervision. We're working very closely with them in partnership with the Department of Health and Aged Care to ensure that they resolve these issues to meet their obligations and improve the quality of care that they're providing. We're also working with the department to ensure that these complex services for elders can continue to be delivered on country in an area where there is no other provider. We're doing this through monitoring the provider closely with regular meetings to hold them to account for fixing the issues. We'll reassess this strategy if the risk to people receiving care changes, and Peter's now going to talk about our individual case management strategy called provider supervision, which kicks into place when we find these significant risks. Thanks, Janet. I'll hand back to you there.
Thank you, Anthony. A really useful survey of provider level audits of home services and how we look particularly at compliance and the ways of prompting services to not just address non-compliance or risk, but also to reach for that continuous improvement. Some more questions we've received, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session after we get through a couple more panellists. Anthony mentioned that Peter's in line, but before we get to Peter, we're going to be talking with Anita Francis, the Senior Clinical Advisor in the Commission, and Anita is going to focus our minds on clinical care issues in non-compliance, complaints and serious incidents from the perspective of the information that we report in our sector performance report. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Janet. You've heard about the importance of effective risk management systems, including appropriate governance that supports the delivery of safe and quality care. A key focus for us is to uplift the sector's understanding and management of clinical risks, which we also call care-related risks. This is the actual or potential for harm to older people receiving care. Effective risk management by providers is imperative to ensure that care and services are cohesive and delivered in a consistently safe, effective and person-centred manner. We can see from the SBR Q4 that compliance with Quality Standard 3 has fallen in home care services. In residential aged care, there was an improvement in compliance with Quality Standard 3 in 2022 to 2023, but this then plateaued and in this quarter has started to drop. We are monitoring this to see whether this is a trend. This is an opportunity for you to review your current systems and processes in relation to clinical risk management. We've drilled down into which requirements in the quality standards have been found to be non-compliant most frequently. You can see here that clinical care issues have lower levels of compliance in both residential and home services. It's also worth noting that where there's poor clinical governance, there is also likely to be poor clinical care. Getting clinical care right requires close and ongoing attention. Clinical skills and expertise are crucial to a provider delivering person-centred, evidence-informed clinical care, and the governance of clinical care must be led with appropriate knowledge and experience in order to understand those inevitable and challenging nuances to providing care to older people who often have complex clinical care needs. Clinical governance is a key overarching factor to reducing care-related harms. It is the bridge between your organisational governance at a governing board level and the care provided to each older person. Clinical governance offers an integrated system to manage the safety and quality of clinical care, to define clear roles, responsibilities, accountability, as well as facilitating regulatory compliance. We can also see from our complaints data that, especially in residential care, the most common and persistent issues are clinical, such as medication management, personal and oral hygiene, and falls prevention and management. Medication administration and management covers a broad range of issues, including but not limited to palliative care and end-of-life care, pain management, time-sensitive medication, diabetes management, recognising and responding to deterioration or a change in condition, behaviour support and use of psychotropic medicines. You can see from our complaints data that complaints raised in relation to personnel number or sufficiency and communication and consultation are also common. Effective workforce and communication are two elements of clinical governance. For more information about clinical governance, the Commission has resources available on our website, including fact sheets and self-assessment tools. Clinical risks and harms are also reflected in our SIRS data, with most of the neglect notifications being about the same topics. The Commission is examining in detail the increasing number of notifications of neglect to identify any patterns or trends that we can share with providers to help them better manage associated risks. Our internal research to date shows that the majority of neglect notifications are related to clinical care, such as medication management, falls, and wound care. Providers need to look at their own data, including their quality indicator data, to better understand what types of events are happening, not just in each of their services, but across all of their services as a whole. Thanks, Janet. Handing back to you.
Thank you, Anita. Lots of food for thought in what you've covered there, and hopefully an encouragement to providers online to have a look at our sector performance report and look particularly at those elements of it which are clinical, and to the extent that a provider is providing clinical care, to reflect on how that relates to their own performance and the things that they may also need to pay attention to, particularly in relation to complaints, serious incidents, and indeed the findings of our quality assessors. So last panellist is Peter, but before I open the mic for Peter, just a final reminder that you can send your questions in at any time by using the question box via the live Q&A tab, and a number of you have found it and are using it, which is great. Now to Peter. Peter is our Executive Director, Compliance Management, and Peter's going to talk about the provider supervision approach to persistent non-compliance that we have set out in our recently published regulatory strategy. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Janet, and really great to be with you all. I'll start by putting up this graph that Lisa and Anthony have already shown you, and that sort of just emphasises that we are obviously concerned to see that flattening of overall compliance rates, particularly for home services, as Anthony has mentioned. We'd hate to see that sticking at 65%, and so we do want to start seeing some movement in that area, and some of what I talk about will hopefully help you think about how you might improve some of those outcomes. We're also focused on the 19 to 20% of ongoing non-compliance in residential services, as we do want to see also that number moving upwards, but we expect that number, given it's getting up to the higher end, will move at a potentially slower rate than what we'd like to see in home services. Although in statistical terms, the line since Q4 of 22-23 is flat, the small fluctuations do suggest that different types of providers audited in a given period may influence overall compliance rates quarter on quarter. It's for that reason that we are interested in starting to put different lenses over the compliance data, as that helps us understand what's driving the sector average. That's important given that we understand that the aged care sector is made up of quite a wide range of different provider types. So looking at compliance rates using different provider profiles can then help guide both the sector and the Commission. For the sector, it assists providers, or hopefully assists providers, to see whether they are an outlier in their own cohort. While for the Commission, it helps us make decisions about where we best direct our time and effort, and importantly, be able to explain why we might be focusing on one group of providers more than another. As this slide shows us, we can see that smaller providers on average struggle with compliance the most. But I want to emphasise that's just the starting point for us, because by doing that sort of analysis, it also helps us to ask better questions. For example, it not only helps us to identify outliers within a particular group, but also drives further analysis to understand factors that might be influencing the average within that group, such as location, for example. Now, I spent a moment talking about that because what we are doing at the sector level to understand causes of compliance risk, you can also be doing yourselves to understand where to direct your own time and attention and effort. For example, we regularly talk to providers who are under our supervision who are doing very well at managing compliance at most of their services, but are doing very poorly at one of them. Where that is the case, this should prompt those providers to reflect on what is happening at that service that is causing their systems, practices and controls to be less effective in containing compliance risk at that service compared to all their other services. Understanding that and then adapting those controls accordingly will not only assist in managing compliance at that single service, but may also enable the provider to keep ahead of emerging issues that may eventually impact all their other services if left unattended. That's because that particular service could be the canary in the coal mine that's indicative of changes in worker or resident profile that will eventually impact the effectiveness of the systems that they have in place across all their other services. And it's at the heart of doing that well is, as others have said, really good governance. And that includes prudent financial governance. I cannot emphasise enough the relationship between good governance and good performance. We consider the initial upward trend in organisational governance was instrumental in the overall improvement we have seen in compliance rates to date. However, as highlighted by Anthony, that improvement has plateaued out. Given the strong relationship between governance and sustained improvement in performance, my compliance managers are very focused on providers' governance arrangements, not just the obligations against Standard 8 that Anthony discussed, but also obligations relating to governing body composition and committees that providers should have in place to support their board to understand and manage risk. Taking those obligations seriously is essential for providers to manage and improve performance in a sustained way. That's because independent voices that question and challenge the status quo are critical to detecting emerging risks early while ensuring mitigation strategies are fit for purpose based on a well-rounded understanding of all operational imperatives. When the Commission gets involved in case managing a provider that has entrenched high-risk non-compliance, the common denominator is often an absence of provider governance that has the right people asking the right questions at the right time. It is that gap that the Commission will often have to fill when we are working closely with a provider, as we initially become the accountability mechanism asking those questions that is often missing at the provider level. Reassuringly, we are finding that most providers with the appropriate level of guidance do start to fill that gap themselves. For those on boards, a big part of that is when they realise that governing well involves understanding the people they are caring for, so they can stand in the shoes of those people when asking questions of their executive and then considering the appropriateness of the responses they get back. It's also about being curious and making sure you are measuring the things that matter, so you are driving the behaviours you want, while ensuring you are well positioned to act early and avoid a situation snowballing into something that can cause harm. Now, on that measurement theme, it's important for providers to see risks at service level as a symptom of potential problems at the provider level. That's why well-performing and well-governed providers work hard at capturing information that helps them detect risk. As providers, you have a lot of information. Now, some of that information you collect forms part of the reporting obligations to the department and the commission, and that includes the quarterly financial information. It's important you don't see that reporting as a chore to keep us happy, but look to harness its benefits. At times, we detect concerning patterns and trends from data that providers give us, and that we collect from them. We are always a little concerned when that leads us to detecting emerging risks that the provider was otherwise unaware of. We want providers to be good at detecting risks themselves and then leading the required change. That's because experience has shown us that provider-led change tends to stick. The main reason for this is that for that change to be sustained, it requires a governing layer that maintains a strong interest in the implementation of improvements through reporting they ask the executive to provide, drawing in on service level data and information. To expand on what I've just discussed, this slide shows how we monitor risk. You can find it in the regulatory strategy and also in the In Focus section on provider supervision in the sector performance report. Much of the data we look at is included at the sector level in the sector performance report that we publish shortly. In the absence of us having any specific risk or compliance concerns, providers will have a risk surveillance supervision status. If we identify a high level of risk and the potential for harm to older people receiving care that leads us to be concerned that might be the case, we will be actively managing a provider through active supervision. As at June, we had 83 providers under active supervision. Where we are concerned that there is severe risk to safety of older people, we will move a provider to heightened supervision. In these complex cases, we will often work with other stakeholders, including the Department of Health and Aged Care. As of June, we had 5 providers under heightened supervision, and we have a couple more than that at the moment. In the upcoming sector performance report, we've included case studies on our approach to help you understand how your engagement with us influences our response to you. It's important to note that we may consider a range of information before allocating a supervision status, or a single issue may result in escalation straight to heightened supervision. There is an example in the case studies in the report that's coming out where we had 2 complaints, including one about the management of an older person with complex and challenging behaviours that made us sufficiently concerned to move the provider under closer supervision. In that case, we were concerned that that issue was potentially representative of broader systemic issues at that provider's service. We were able to work with the provider and the department to resolve the situation, enabling us to then reduce the intensity of our supervision over them. Now, I'll just finish with this slide as it touches on information in the sector report about our enforcement activities that sit alongside what we call our forward-looking compliance work, which is what I've just been speaking about now. We consider our compliance management work to be forward-looking, as the purpose of our work in that space is to make sure that providers are continuously improving and delivering an excellent aged care experience for those in their care, while also being incentivised to put in place the right systems and controls to prevent foreseeable harm happening. In any regulatory model, there must also be consequences for behaviours or failures that harm people. In the Commission, we have a team whose role is also to investigate work at governing person and provider conduct. They are prompted to investigate where we receive reports of unacceptable worker or provider behaviour that resulted in people having been exposed to an unacceptable level of risk or harm. By its nature, the enforcement team's investigation work involves looking back at circumstances leading up to an allegation or incident to determine whether we need to take a specific enforcement action. One example of that may be a banning of workers or governing persons or an infringement notice. I wanted to finish by sharing that slide, as our enforcement activities are an important safeguarding and accountability mechanism, which will at times happen in parallel to our compliance management work. That's because when harm occurs, we want to see providers working hard to mitigate risk to prevent a reoccurrence of that harm. That will involve case management by our compliance managers. At the same time, depending on the nature of the issue, investigators from the enforcement team may also be taking an interest in what happened to determine if that harm or high level of risk was prompted us becoming involved was due to any unacceptable conduct on the part of the worker, governing person or provider. I'll finish with, and where we do establish that that is the case, it may lead to an enforcement action being taken. I'll finish there and I'll hand back to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Peter. And that rounds out our panellists and their contributions to the main body of the session, but of course they'll be participating with me in the Q&A, which we move to now. And thank you everyone for the questions you submitted. We also had some questions which came in earlier, and I'll mix the two together to ensure that we cover as many as possible. Peter, you've just finished, and I'll keep you on the stage, as it were, because we've had a couple of questions from people who perhaps don't know as much as we would want them to about the work we do in monitoring financial viability. And the observations have been made very accurately that what's happening in relation to a provider's management of the money sometimes has a very direct correlation or impact on the quality and safety of care that they deliver. So there have been a couple of questions. Do we pay any attention to that? Do you want to take that one up, please?
Look, I'm very pleased to take that question, Janet, and absolutely. We monitor very closely the quarterly financial information, and we also consider that alongside the annual financial reporting, because we see that a provider's financial viability situation as a key potential key lead indicator of safety and quality risk down the track. Because when a provider is experiencing financial issues, that can lead to that provider making expenditure decisions that can translate into harm. So we have a team that is dedicated to monitoring changes in viability, and that also reach out to providers where we're seeing patterns that suggest that they might be experiencing financial difficulties. And we also marry that up with other information that we know about a provider, and certainly when we engage with a provider where there is quality and safety risk, we actually are very reliant also on a well-rounded understanding of that provider's financial situation, because that's going to be key to their investment in improvement.
Good answer. Thank you very much. Anthony, I have one for you. And we've had a number of questions from people wanting to understand a bit more about our quality audit of home services. And I wonder whether you could just give a quick outline of some of the things that your team are finding through those audits of home services and home service providers.
Certainly. Thanks, Janet. Look, the things that we are finding in those quality audits are not significantly different from the issues that we published back in June 2022 in those 5 key areas of risk that we see in home services. So we're continuing to see particular issues and risks in relation to care planning that I mentioned in my presentation. Governance is another one, and particular issues that are coming up in relation to fees management and the involvement, particularly of older people in their care planning. We often find, particularly in CHSP services, that there is an consideration that care planning is not as important for someone receiving, say, for example, a transport service as it might be for someone who's receiving a mix of more complex home care services. But of course, the importance of the quality standard is to identify changes in people's care needs, and sometimes you can see that in some of those lower risk services. So it's important that all providers have a role in identifying, documenting, and responding to those risks that they're finding as care planning needs change. I'd point people to the 5 key risks document as a continuing great resource that we've published on our website, and that's available as a further source of information of possible strategies and activities that providers might take in response to those common issues.
Great. Let me keep you on mic. You have mentioned governance, and indeed I think every single speaker mentioned it somewhere in their comments. I'd like to do a bit more of a drill down because some of the questions also go to this expectation on organisational governance. Can you just sketch for us what good governance looks like in home services? What are we looking for?
Of course. We're looking for the practical application of systems and how that translates person-centred care into how an organisation governs itself. We see that good governance encourages feedback. It responds to feedback. It looks for ideas for improvement from people about receiving the care that they receive, and that includes feedback and opportunities for improvement received from families and representatives of those older Australians. We see that a really well-governed provider acts on that feedback, that they adapt their existing practices and it influences how they change their business or their activities within their business. And it ultimately benefits the quality of the care for the provider, of course. A really, really good example that we saw recently of that was where a provider operates, say, a feedback and complaints portal, which is online and it's open to not just the people that are receiving those services, but it's communicated to the family of those people and to their representatives as being available for them to provide feedback and opportunities for improvement and we saw that the provider acts on that. And that portal, in that case, included anonymous feedback, which was important for some individuals. And so we saw that translate through every level of governance in that provider. So we saw that the board responded to that information, that they used that information to then commission additional activity. So in that instance, we saw that there was a project that was stood up that looked at the skills and the professional behaviours of domestic cleaners in that service. And that led to improvements in the care experience as a consequence of that continuous improvement. So it's those sorts of examples that we look for and we see as being excellent cases.
Okay, really useful examples. Thank you very much. Let me stay with the general topic of governance, but perhaps render it slightly more specific in clinical governance. Anita, I'm coming in your direction. Can you give us an example of what good clinical governance looks like, which is a subset of overarching organisational governance?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Great question. The purpose of clinical governance is to ensure that older Australians are receiving high quality care. And just as Anthony was talking about around the practical application of systems and processes, this is what good clinical governance looks like as well, seeing that practical application of systems and processes in in clinical areas. An example from point of care would be a care worker who recognises a change in an older person that's unusual for them and escalates this to clinical staff, which triggers a clinical assessment by a registered nurse. There then are changes required in the provision of care. These happen in consultation with the older person and their family, results in updated care plans and the communication of these changes to the workforce. The provider had policies and procedures in place as well as the training for that workforce that ensured that the changes in condition and to the care needs were identified and responded to. So that's an example of clinical governance in action at the point of care. Another example, similar to what Anthony was talking about, is where a provider reviewed incident and quality indicator data where there was an increase in pressure injuries at the service. After analysis of the data and investigation, they identified some workforce issues that had resulted in the missed care, and the missed care was a contributing factor to the increase in the trend in pressure injuries. So the provider made changes to their workforce rostering and reviewed their systems and processes in relation to skin care, resulting in improvements in care at the service and a reduction in pressure injuries. So there are a couple of examples for you about clinical governance in action at both point of care and at the more provider level, and looking at incident and other data to help identify and improve systems and processes.
Thank you, Anita. All right, Peter. Lisa mentioned the regulatory diamond, and I think you did as well. And we've got some questions coming in about its practical application, particularly in relation to provider supervision, which is the model that you also expanded on. So if I can paraphrase one of the questions, provider, how do I show that I am willing and able to fix a problem, which was language you may have used, where a provider is veering towards or demonstrating non-compliance or risk. And we have identified that, we've brought this to the provider's attention, and according to our regulatory diamond, the next step in the sequence is for the provider to make some really good choices about what they're going to do to fix it. But the question is, what is the nature of our monitoring, and how are we going to be convinced that the provider is doing the right thing as expected?
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Janet. And look, I'll start by saying that, just to echo what you've said, we are trying to create an environment where we provide as much opportunity as possible before we start pulling out the regulatory tools, because ultimately our objective is that providers fix the problems that are causing risk, which is ultimately the regulatory outcome we all desire, regardless of whether you're a provider, a consumer, or the commission. So the first thing for us is we want to see a provider that understands what is causing the issue, and to be able to show us that they've got a sensible plan to fix it. If they do that and are able and willing to show us that they are actively working on implementing that plan, then that will inform what we do next. So we do need to see evidence, not just of the plan, but evidence that the promised action has been taken. And that will include documentation at times. It will come out of case management conversations, and depending on the nature of the risks we are concerned about, it will also include some on-site assessment of the effectiveness of the remedial actions that have been implemented. And we also consider how, as part of that, and part of our trust in the provider, we consider, how well the provider has potentially worked with us in the past, and that will inform how much latitude we give a provider within the case management setting. So we do look at past actions that indicate if a provider has failed to deliver on improvements by agreed dates. We'll look at the potential areas of lack that demonstrate a lack of commitment to following up on issues we raise with them, or where they might be demonstrating a lack of understanding or interest in understanding the causes of compliance risk, and also displaying behaviours that suggest they are not able to do the necessary planning, and it's in those situations that we would then consider putting a bit more structure around the provider. But our starting position is we will work with a provider who is willing to work with us, and our focus is on that compliance risk is mitigated and addressed as soon as possible, so that older people in care are well looked after. And what tools we use and when we use them is very much flows out of our engagement with that provider.
just to extend where you landed there, for perfect clarity, so you're not saying that we don't use our formal powers, but we use them for a particular purpose. Do you just want to expand on that slightly? Because I think you've been clear, but just to underscore the point, that the tools remain available to us and we're willing to use them in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I think the key term is they are compliance tools. So we use them for a purpose, and we will use them when we see provider behaviour that suggests that they won't act without greater incentive, and so we will use. So most of our compliance tools are to compel action or require a provider to take a particular course of action. If we believe a course of action is needed, or that the provider needs to do something and they are reluctant and resistant to doing that, or have made promises that they haven't kept, then we will use our tools to compel the action that needs to be taken. Because one of the incentives when we use our tools is that if a provider does not do what's required, then there is a sanction that can be imposed. But as I said, we will have conversations with providers about the different pathways available to them, so that they fully understand how we're approaching the task. And if we do need to use the tools, as I say to providers, it's opportunity given, opportunity squandered.
Thank you for being so clear. There have been some questions or comments about the costs of governance and ensuring compliance, and where this money is expected to come from. And I suppose I'll take that one, because it's a really fundamental question, and one that I really want all providers to understand as clearly as I'm hoping to express it. The governance that we've talked about, organisational governance, clinical governance, is part of the price of the ticket to play. Every older Australian receiving care has an expectation that that care will be safe and high quality, and that their well-being and quality of life will be supported through receiving that care. So they have a reasonable expectation that providers will be managing risks and ensuring that they remain compliant, and that they reach beyond compliance towards excellence. Now, you won't always get there, and sometimes things will go wrong. But what we as a regulator are looking for is that you have the systems of oversight, the processes, the procedures, in order to A, identify it, and B, correct it, and C, work with those who may have been affected to restore their trust and their confidence in you as a provider. And that's all part of the expectation that is placed upon you as a provider of Commonwealth subsidised aged care. It's not some add-on, it's not something additional. It is fundamentally and integrally part of the responsibilities you take on as a provider. Hope that's clear. Lisa, I think I'm probably going to send the last question in your direction. And someone's asked, what impact will the new aged care have on our sector performance report? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks very much, Janet. That's a great question. And it will impact on the report, because the new Act is going to require us to change how we understand performance in the sector and the different data points that we use to form that picture. Because the introduction of the strengthened standards and the changes to our compliance powers means that by necessity there'll be a series break, so we won't be able to keep measuring the things that we currently measure, because we'll be measuring different things. But that also, I think, brings some new opportunities to get better insight into some of the key issues in the sector. So, for example, we'll have a new standard coming on food, nutrition and dining. There'll be an opportunity for us to understand granular data around that standard much more. And another big change that's coming with the new Aged Care Act, of course, is the introduction of the 6 registration categories that group like services together. And our data sets for each registration category are going to vary depending on the particular obligations that apply, and also how we use our regulatory powers. But those registration categories, I think, are also a really exciting opportunity for us to present performance view around service types, which is more granular than what we have now. And I think that'll be helpful for providers in terms of being able to compare their own performance with groups of other like providers. So we're thinking through what this might look like, and also talking with the Department of Health and Aged Care about how together we tackle the task of creating a baseline that will help us to track changes and improvements in performance over time. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Lisa. And that brings us to the end of our time. So thank you, everyone, for paying such close attention and submitting all of your questions. We did get to a few of them, many of them, regrettably not all of them, but keep an eye on our website for continuing publication of relevant information which would assist you in ensuring you understand the performance obligations under the current Act and what will be expected of you under the new Act when it's passed. We have made a number of changes to our sector performance report over time, and we do hope it's a more readable document, it's a more useful document to you to assist in your own quality assurance objectives and also your peer benchmarking. From the title of this session, you would understand that we are encouraging you to join the dots, take the content of the report and use it to assist you in detecting and managing risk and preventing harm and delivering an awesome experience for every single person to whom you provide care. Keep your eye out for the next edition of our sector performance report, which should be published in the next fortnight, we're hoping. A reminder to stay online to complete the feedback survey, please. We're very keen to hear what you think. And finally, a reminder that the recording of this session will be available on our website in coming days. That brings us to a close. Thank you, everyone. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.